Our next speaker is an irrigator and a long-time tomato grower. Used to be a long-time tomato grower. Peter Walsh was actually the minister responsible back in 2012 for negotiating that social and economic neutrality clause, and I remember it was a pretty hard-fought battle, and right at the end we had Xenophon and a few others trying to knock it out. We had the word up to 450 in there, and that was another battle we had to have. And I think it's really important to recognise that the Victorian government back in 2011 released some modelling which showed that at 2100 gig recovery, that the lower lakes were looked after, as were a number of other key wetlands. And I'd be interested, Peter, I guess a question to you. Do you think that anything has changed since then, or has anything changed that you've seen that would change your thinking around how much water is actually needed?
Thanks, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. I suppose nothing has changed as far as the amount of water that's needed, in my view, Tom. I think that modelling, we had a huge fight with the authority and the Commonwealth to actually get a copy of the base model, and as the government we actually then got SKM to run that model with some different parameters around it compared to what the authority was doing, to prove that you could, with 2150 of actually held water, you could achieve the environmental outcomes that were needed in the lower lakes instead of the 2750 of water, because it's about how the AHD level in those lakes. So you don't actually need the 450 to achieve anything in South Australia. It can be achieved at 2150 of actually held water, and the 650 of offsets, which is now 605, is actually about achieving environmental outcomes at certain points down the river, very similar to what the Hatter Lakes project is. And for those that actually look at the Hatter Lakes now and say that's a great project, if you actually go back to the original discussions in the plan, the Hatter Lakes actually scored very poorly until we got the model changed that actually changed the score rating for those projects, because the original model talked about whole of reach of river, not particular projects. So by changing some of the parameters in the plan through that time, as you reminded me, Tom, you could actually show that you could actually achieve the outcomes that were needed to deliver on what the intent of the project was in the plan. So you don't need 450 to achieve anything in the way of environmental outcomes for the lower lakes. It can be done with the water that's talked about in the plan. So the questions that we're asked to talk about was what next, and I think some of the discussions over lunch was, yes, it's been very interesting to refresh all the problems we've got, but what do we do next? My view is that we need to break it down and do it sequentially, and break it down to bite-sized chunks, that if you put a whole heap of new information out there, too many people just get confused and you lose your key messages. So as Damien touched on, it's about getting the 605 not disallowed, or get it through the Parliament, getting, as Austin said, getting the 70 back in and getting that through the system, and then having the discussion about the 450 of upwater. And there's a lot of work already been done, and I congratulate the Shepparton group for that, about the economic modelling, but actually getting a true economic model that can prove whether there's economic neutrality or positivity out of that. I actually think the authority got the process wrong by doing the Ernst & Young report before the socio-economic report was released by the Basin Authority. I believe that EY report should be redone after all the economic modelling's out about the socio-economic costs of the plan, because I think you'll actually get a very different outcome. I don't think that EY report was well informed, because that work hadn't been done at that particular time. So socio-economic on the 450, as has been touched on by quite a few people. Again, the discussion in the plan was, we kept telling the Commonwealth, Tony Burke, and telling South Australia in particular, you cannot get that amount of water down the river without flooding people out. And they kept saying, yes, we can. I kept saying, no, you can't. And that's why the constraint study came about. And the constraint study, I think all the work that's been done so far has proven that you can't get that water down the river without deliberately flooding someone. And again, there is the condition in the plan that the Commonwealth will not deliberately flood anyone and will not compulsorily require flood overlay. So while those caveats are in the plan, again, I don't believe you can get that additional water down the river, and that's the other part of the argument, apart from the socio-economic. And the third one, I suppose, I already touched on that hasn't been talked about yet, Tom, but which I spoke on at the start, is what's actually the environmental benefit of an extra 450? I think the work's been done to prove that it's not needed, and I think that's the third leg of the stool that needs to be talked about once the 605 and the 70 are through the system. The things that were raised today, Ken, I think some really good stuff you raised around the barrages, around Lock Zero and around the Coorong. My only hesitation would be if we jump to that debate now, I think we actually miss the point of getting those things through that I've talked about. I think that's the next step after the 605, the 70 and the argument's been had around the 450. If we then focus on the lower lakes, that drainage into the Coorong, $200 million, you get 60 gigs of fresh water into the Coorong. There's a project that's been sitting there now as long as I've been involved in parliamentary water politics. South Australia will never ever talk about it because they don't want to spoil the good stories in the Adelaide Advertiser. That's all our fault about the Coorong. So that's the discussion after the, as I said, break it down to bite-sized chunks. The old saying, best way to eat an elephant is one mouthful at a time. We need to do this sequentially, otherwise it just gets to be a lot of noise, a lot of energy lost with people yelling at each other and not necessarily getting the outcome at the end. So I think the framework is there. We just need to harness everyone working together to make sure we get to the end of it and use that framework, because I think we can actually achieve a positive outcome. Thank you.